Welcome to the Seahawks Forever podcast. In-depth analysis on everything Seahawks. And now, here's your host, Dan Viens.
All right, you guys, just going to jump into this one today because we have breaking news out of the NFL Combine in Indianapolis. Seahawks beat reporter Corbin Smith, host of Locked On Seahawks, is reporting that John Schneider has had conversations with multiple teams at the Combine about wide receiver DK Metcalf, and that the most aggressive team has been the Green Bay Packers. This report has been corroborated by Packers reporter Peter Bukowski, host of Locked On Packers, that there is actually a concrete offer on the table from the Packers that they believe is substantial enough to get Schneider to bite and potentially make DK Metcalf a Green Bay Packer. Reportedly, what's being discussed is a combination of draft picks and a young receiver off of their roster. I'll get into that in just a second. The Packers have a bunch of receivers that are young and have upside, but there are question marks there about fit, contract, next contract, and then what do you do with DK Metcalf? This has been a storyline for quite a while, right? Simply because he enters into the last year of his deal. DK, of course, just 27 years old, but entering into that last year of his second contract where he is set to count $31.9 million against the Seahawks salary cap. You can see the numbers here on the screen. Seventh all-time among Seahawks receivers in catches with 438. His 6,324 receiving yards is sixth all-time at 48 touchdowns, fourth all-time. Now, Mike Macdonald has said he wants him on the roster. He loves the style of play that he brings. John Schneider has said the same thing. But he's also said that, look, we'll listen, right? There's a business standpoint to this. That cap hit is significant. The Seahawks, as we sit here today, still $6 million or so over the salary cap, even after the recent numbers were announced earlier this week in Indianapolis, and they exceeded what most teams are expecting the cap to be this season. If you trade him, you will save $10.9 million against the salary cap, minus any player coming back, and I'll touch on that in just a second. It's been a topic of discussion for a couple of months now, simply because the salary cap is what it is. And if you're going to be able to go out in free agency and be aggressive, and especially in upgrading that offensive line, you're going to need to clear money somewhere. Now, we've done the scenarios. I've talked about it here on the show. You can clear enough cap space to be able to be active in free agency, extend your guys, put a good roster together for next year without touching DK Metcalf's contract. Or certainly you can extend DK, lower his 2025 cap hit, and keep him in the fold for years to come. I still say that that's plan A. I don't think John Schneider wants to trade DK. I don't think he's the one out there trying to find a suitor. But it's any general manager's job, any good general manager's job, to consider all possibilities. There's more than one way to build a roster. And we have talked about it for years. The imbalance on this roster when it comes to spending. 32nd out of 32 teams in the league spending on their offensive line. It's a direct correlation to some of the issues they've had there, and a direct impact on the Seahawks' ability to get to and succeed in the playoffs. Bad offensive line play. If you want to reshape the roster in that manner, especially if you want to get out there and go after some of the better free agent offensive linemen like Drew Dahlman, who we've talked about, you have to clear some money somewhere. But I want you to ask yourselves as we walk through this and I show you what the Packers have to offer, try to take emotion out of it and think about it from a business standpoint. DK Metcalf's everything you want in a football player. I've been around him. I've seen him. I've seen the guys interact with him. He's an alpha dog. He's the one they look to. They love him. Among fans, he's a little more polarizing. Some of the penalties, right? Some of the emotional outbursts and the dumb personal foul penalties, although he cleaned that up to a large extent last year. And the fact that he really is a limited receiver in some respects. Doesn't run a complete route tree. He's not the twitchiest route runner of all time to gain separation that way, but he wins with physicality. He wins with toughness. He wins over the middle. He kind of personifies a little bit of that Marshawn Lynch kind of beast mode mentality in a wide receiver's body. He's also very, very durable. I remember when he came out in the draft thinking, that's not going to work. Like I see the athleticism, but 2.53% body fat, like that just screams soft core tissue injuries and things like that. He's been incredibly durable and tough. He will play hurt. He will play through injuries. Now, the report from Smith and Bukowski reiterates this, that it would be a combination of draft picks and players. The Packers right now only have 3 picks in the 2025 draft. They're first, second, and third. That's the 23rd pick in the draft, the 54th, and the 87th. I know what you're all thinking because we all have that fantasy football mentality, right? DK Metcalf's not going to get you a first-round pick and a player, most likely. He's not going to get you that number 23 pick. Maybe. I mean, it all depends on how bad the Packers want him. Maybe Schneider can negotiate that. But most likely, we're talking about 54, maybe something on day 3, and then a player off their roster. Now, what the Packers are offering, and according to Bukowski, they believe they have put a package on the table that's significant enough for the Seahawks to consider. They think they can get him if Schneider's willing to move him. Well, this is what their receiving core looks like. Very, very interesting from the standpoint of they're all very young. They're all on their rookie contracts. They're all under Christian Watson's the oldest one there at 25. And they're not making a lot of money yet. But that's part of the issue here, right? So left to right, Romeo Doubs, 24 years old, $3.5 million cap hit this year. Dontavian Wicks, 23 years old, a $1.1 million cap hit. Jaden Reed, 24, $1.9 million cap hit. And Christian Watson, 25, $2.9 million cap hit. So whatever you save $10.9 million by trading DK, you got to subtract those numbers for whichever one of those players you might think that you'd like to have back in trade from the eventual cap savings. So theoretically, the Seahawks could trade DK Metcalf for the number 54 pick and Romeo Doubs today, and they're going to save $7.4 million of the cap against the cap. All that does for you today is get you compliant. They'd be a couple $100,000 under the cap if they made that move today. Is that significant enough for you to make that move? But I want you to look at it from just a pure football standpoint, because when I look at this group of receivers, there's issues with all of them, which is exactly why the Packers are out trying to make a move like this. These guys are all young. They all have upside. Why would they be looking to do this? Because clearly they don't believe any of these 4 can be a true number 1. Watson probably the closest to it, the most explosive downfield, but he's had injury issues, can't stay healthy. He's also in the last year of his deal. Wicks and Reed are a little bit different in that they don't hit free agency until 2027. So you would be getting, in baseball terms, 2 years of club control at cheap salary cap numbers for either of those guys. I put a poll up a month ago, because this is another aspect to this too. This isn't the first time we've heard this connection. It was reported at the beginning of February that the Packers were one of the teams really interested, actively interested in exploring a trade for DK Metcalf. At the time, I posted a poll on Twitter. If that were to occur, I guessed back then that the logical return for DK Metcalf would involve one of these young receivers. You want to replace that production, especially when you consider that Tyler Lockett is most likely not going to be on this roster next year. So you trade DK Metcalf. Now you're talking about Jackson Smith and Jigba and what? So you'd want to get a receiver back. It's not a great receiver draft this year. There's some cool talents in there, especially on day 2 that I like. The free agent market's pretty barren. You're not going to get T. Higgins. If you're going to go for T. Higgins, you're going to keep DK Metcalf. Like, financially, that just doesn't make sense. I've heard Chris Godwin mentioned a number of times, but we're talking about a guy in the last 3 years that's had an ACL and now is coming off a massive compound fracture of his leg at over 30 years old now. I don't want to touch that. Cooper Kupp, if he gets released, bring him back to the Northwest. There's all sorts of possibilities that if this happens, we can talk about then. But strictly just sticking to the report today, here's why it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. In that poll a month ago, I asked you which of these receivers you'd prefer to receive in trade. Overwhelmingly, almost 50% of you said Jaden Reed. And from a talent standpoint, I would agree with you. fell in love with this kid when he was at the Senior Bowl 2 years ago out of Michigan State. But to me, Reed is way too similar in play style, stature to what they have, to Jackson Smith and Jigba. You'd have two guys that operate better out of the slot, can play outside, but that's not where they're going to thrive, and they're both sub 6 foot. You know, I keep going back to this analogy that you hear in scouting circles about building a receiver room, kind of like you build a basketball team. And I want variety in my wide receiver room. So Wicks is intriguing to me. 6'1". He's got some explosiveness to him. Had some production last year. He's the one of those four that I would think would make the most sense. The low cap hit, 2 years of control, and a little bit different in style from JSN. But here's what I want to suggest to you today. What do the Seahawks need when you look at this roster? And you consider who they just hired as their offensive coordinator, and Clint Kubiak, and the system he runs, the scheme he runs. Among the leaders in the NFL on frequency of 12 and 13 personnel, 2 tight ends, 3 tight ends. What do the Seahawks have on their roster at the moment at the tight end position? Noah Fant, who has a $13.4 million cap hit this year. You'd like to have him back. McDonald mentioned that. Schneider mentioned that this week in Indianapolis. McDonald called him a complete tight end. He's still just 27 years old. I think Kubiak would like him, but not at that cap hit. So is he willing to restructure that? Are they going to extend him? That's a starting point. A.J. Barner, the rookie out of Michigan last year, still really young, 22 years old. We loved what we saw from him last year as a two-way tight end, a guy that can play in line and block, but also showed a little more juice in the passing game than most analysts expected coming out of Michigan. So you have 2 guys. Then you get down to Brady Russell, Tyler Mabry. Those aren't guys you're going to build around. The Packers also have 2 very, very intriguing young tight ends on their roster, Tucker Kraft and Luke Musgrave. Now, Kraft is the one that's been the more productive over his first 2 years, 81 catches and 9 touchdowns. Luke Musgrave from the Northwest, played at Oregon State, from Bend, Oregon, only played 7 games last year because of injury, and there were some injury issues with him coming out of Oregon State, so that's something you'd have to be comfortable with. But his rookie year, 34 catches, very productive. The better two-way player, I think, of the 2. Kraft is a guy that's more of a dynamic receiving threat. If I'm John Schneider and I'm considering trading DK, because keep in mind, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's moving parts here, right? I could play the Wonderful Mind GIF here with all the calculations flying in the background, right? You're thinking about this year's roster, the salary cap space, plans that you have, that you know that you have because you've discussed them already with your scouting staff, your coaches, your front office. They have plans that they're ready to execute, guys that they want to go after in free agency. They're putting their draft board together and making plans for the end of April. They have an idea. They have a plan A, B, C, D, E, so they know how all this would fit into that. If one of those plans involves trading DK Metcalf as a valuable piece of that plan, then to me, what makes the most sense is you're gonna negotiate. You're gonna counter. First of all, I'm gonna try to get that first round pick. I'm gonna try to get 23. And you know what? I'll take 23 and maybe something else and not even need a player in return, to be honest. That would give you the 18th pick, the 23rd. You could trade down, pick up a lot of assets, really take more bites of that apple in that range of the top 100 in this draft that's so strong. But I'm going for, if it comes down to having to take a player off their roster, I'm going for one of those tight ends. Either one I think would fit. So that's where I'm at with that. Again, it's not, I try to take the emotion out of these things when I look at them, because I think, again, to be a good general manager, to be a good manager at any level, you to some extent have to. Sometimes a player is such a dynamic force, a force multiplier, such an impact on your roster that he's untouchable. Because of some of the limitations physically that DK has in the pass game, because he's in the last year of his deal, because you're going to have to pay him $30 million average annual value or around there next year, and JSN is going to be eligible for an extension next year as well, it might make sense if the return is right. And that's another reason, let me put this back up. That's another reason that I don't love. Most of you have come back and told me this morning, Dobbs or Watson. And that makes sense because they've been the most productive. And certainly Watson has shown the most explosion. Dobbs has 2, downfield threat. He's had some drops issues. But those guys are on the verge of being extended as well. Why trade DK Metcalf when the primary benefit of doing so would be to save money and in return get a young receiver who's on the verge of being paid his second contract at the exact same time that you also have to do that for Jackson, Smith, and Jigba? A lot to think about. A lot to think about. And I know what I'm going to see a lot of in the comments because this has been a topic of discussion for 2 years, really. Local radio here has talked about trading DK Metcalf for a long time, and I understand why it makes sense. And I know some of you are also going to come back and say, well, if we didn't pay a mid-level quarterback $40 million, we could afford to keep DK. Understand that too. That's a different discussion, one we've had, one we'll continue to have. But there are different ways to build a roster. And for this team to get to where they want to get to and play the way Mike McDonald wants them to play, much more similarly to what we saw the Philadelphia Eagles do in winning a Super Bowl this year than the way the Seahawks have played in recent years, which is invest in your trenches, beat people up front, right? And then use this Shanahan offense to control the football, run the football, move the chains, hold on to the ball, and then be able to hit you over the top with some big plays as well. DK may be the only guy on the roster that has that kind of cachet, trade value. You can get into some of your young defensive stars, probably. I mean, you want to talk about Devin Witherspoon, somebody like that. But of the players that, if you, again, take emotion out of it, would make the most sense to give you an asset worth trading to get legitimate return, there aren't a lot of those guys on the roster, and DK is certainly one of them. I'd hate to see it from a fan perspective. Just want to state this for the record before I wrap this up. I want him on the roster. I want to figure out a way to build this roster, fix things up front on the offensive line, add the pieces you need, and keep him. Because I do think he's that force multiplier. I do think players feed off him. And he comes up with big plays in big moments. And I think we're on the verge, too, of having a play caller and a coaching staff on offense now with all those veterans that they brought in that know each other well and know how to run this scheme. I think we're on the verge of seeing the best of Geno Smith and the best of DK Metcalf. It would be, from a fan perspective, a shame to see him go and then see this offense build itself in the vision that would have fit DK perfectly. But from a business standpoint, I get it. And if it happens, tune in here. I'll be one of the first to talk about it. And if that happens, as I do with anything, because it's how my brain works, I will immediately shift into, okay, now what? How do we take this and make the most of it? That'll do it. Just wanted to hop on and give my reaction. Day 2 of the Combine today. I'm actually going to be hanging out with Bill Alvstad of the Seahawks Playbook podcast. We're going to be watching it together, and then we're going to sit down, set up the camera, and react to it together. So look for that show tonight. There will not be a live stream tonight, but I will do that show when I upload it after it's produced. I will do it as a live premiere so I can watch it along with you. We can comment together. That's on the YouTube channel, so make sure you subscribe and hit that bell button so you're always notified when new episodes are posted. In the meantime, follow me on Twitter and Blue Sky at Seahawks Forever. Until later tonight, stay tuned. Lots going on in Indianapolis. Thanks for watching, you guys. Forever and always, go Hawks.